There are 58,220 names carved into the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. Every single one of them represents a life lost. But one name sits on that wall that should never have been there. Not because the sacrifice was any less real, but because the person behind that name was only 15 years old. His name was Dan Bullock. He forged his birth certificate at 14, walked into a Marine recruiting station in Brooklyn, and nobody stopped him. 9 months later, he was dead in a bunker in Vietnam. He was 15 years old. The sad truth is that Bullock wasn't an isolated case. He was the most visible casualty of a recruitment system so broken that children could slip through and end up in a war zone on both sides of the conflict. This is the story that they don't put into the textbooks. Now, to understand how a 14-year-old ended up on a battlefield, you need to understand the system that was supposed to have prevented it in the first place. During the Vietnam War, the rules were straightforward. You had to be 18 to enlist on your own, 17 with a parent's signature. Anybody younger than 17 was legally prohibited from serving under Article 83 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The draft, authorized under the Military Selective Service Act of 1967, covered men aged 18 to 26. On paper, that system looked solid. In practice, it was full of holes. The standard proof of age was a birth certificate, and during the 1960s, many recruiting stations accepted photocopies or even hospital-issued physician statements. These documents could be altered with a ballpoint pen. Dan Bullock changed the year on his form, 1953, to 1949. That was it. That's all it took. The parental consent form, known as DD Form 373, required zero verification either. Recruiters weren't required to call or visit parents to confirm signatures. And with the Vietnam escalation ramping up between 1966 and 1968, recruiters were under intense pressure to meet quotas. According to the Veterans of Underage Military Service, or VUMS, an organization founded in 1991 by Alan Stover, who himself enlisted in the Coast Guard at 14, some recruiters actively coached applicants. Documented testimonies describe recruiters telling boys to come up with any kind of birth record listing you as 17. VUMS estimates that 250,000 to 300,000 Americans served underage across World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined. And then there was Project 100,000, launched on October 1st, 1966 by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. Project 100,000 lowered the Armed Forces Qualification Test cutoff from the 31st percentile to the 10th. The stated goal was to give disadvantaged men a path to opportunity. The actual result was funneling roughly 354,000 so-called New Standards men into the military by 1971. Oh, those recruits, drawn disproportionately from poor Black and Hispanic communities, died at roughly 3 times the rates of other troops. 5,478 killed, 20,270 wounded. The program didn't specifically target underage recruits, but it created a quota-driven culture where asking too many questions was discouraged. But the numbers and the policies, they only tell part of the story. To understand what this system actually produced, you need to meet the boy it killed. Dan Bullock was born on December 21st, 1953 in Goldsboro, North Carolina. He grew up in the segregated South. Yeah, it existed. His mom died when he was around 11 years old. After that, Dan and his younger sister Gloria moved north to the Williamsburg neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York to live with their father and his stepmother. Dan talked about wanting to be a pilot, then a firefighter, then a Marine. His father pushed him toward school. Dan told him that enlisting was the quickest way to get an education. In September 1968, at about 5'9" and roughly 160 pounds, Bullock walked into the Marine Corps recruitment station at Albee Square in downtown Brooklyn. He handed over a birth certificate that he had altered, changing his birth year from 1953 to 1949. The recruiters, they accepted it without question. He enlisted on September 18, 1968. Bullock was sent to Platoon 3039 at Parris Island, South Carolina. Boot camp was brutal for everybody. For a 14-year-old kid, it was something else entirely. Fellow recruit Franklin MacArthur later recalled that some Marines planned a blanket party to punish Bullock for falling behind on long runs. MacArthur says he stopped it. He also started running alongside Bullock, helping him keep pace. Bullock graduated boot camp on December 10, 1968. He was 11 days away from turning 15 years old. He arrived in South Vietnam on May 18, 1969. He was assigned as a rifleman to 2nd Squad, 2nd Platoon, Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, 1st Marine Division. His duty station was An Hoa Combat Base in Quang Nam Province, one of the most dangerous areas of operations in the entire war. Marines there had authorization to use their weapons at any time. His fellow Marines were battle-hardened, and they sensed something was off about the new guy.
You know, I have nightmares about it. You can't believe what happened. Well, I was the one that had to go and identify Dan's body, and the nightmares are, you know, just seeing the face. These men were just like us. They put their life on the line, but yet they don't get the recognition.
Some come to his grave in North Carolina to salute the youngest Marine who kept a secret. Dan Bullock signed up for the Marines at age 14. His nephew, Nathan.
It's not clear who helped him alter his birth certificate.
Even before Vietnam, boot camp was treacherous. Franklin MacArthur was there with Bullock in 1968.
Marines, white Southern Marines, wanted to give a blanket.
Corporal Steve Piscatelli, who arrived alongside Bullock, felt protected from the start. He tried to get Bullock to open up. Years later, he told the press he wouldn't talk, he wouldn't open up, but he was 15. He wasn't going to tell me. On the evening of June 6, 1969, Piscatelli dislocated his thumb while sparring with Bullock. The injury kept him off of the night watch. Bullock was supposed to be on cleaning duty that night, but when another Marine was wounded, Bullock was reassigned to a bunker near the airstrip. Shortly after midnight on June 7, 1969, North Vietnamese Army sappers breached the perimeter wire and launched a coordinated assault with rockets, mortars, and small arms fire. A satchel charge was thrown through the firing slot of Bullock's bunker. Dan Bullock was killed instantly. He had only been in Vietnam for 21 days. 6 days later, New York Times reporters arrived at the Bullock family's apartment on Lee Avenue in Brooklyn. What the family told them stunned the country. Dan Bullock was 15 years old. Fox Company learned the truth only when the news broke. That's the first we heard of it, Piscatelli recalled. I should have known he was 15. I should have guessed it. Dan Bullock was the youngest, but he was far from the only kid who fought and died in this war. According to Department of Defense records and the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, Dan was the only confirmed 15-year-old American killed in the war. 5 Americans killed in action were 16, 12 were 17. Among the 17-year-old casualties, Private James Calvin Ward was killed in Dinh Thuong Province on October 11, 1965. His death, along with that of another miner named Terry White, triggered the single most significant wartime age reform. On November 9th and 10th, 1965, Secretary McNamara ordered all branches to stop sending 17-year-olds to Vietnam and to pull out those already in country. Between 1,200 and 1,400 teenagers were transferred to non-combat stations, and that rule still exists to this day. 17-year-olds can enlist, but they can't deploy to combat. Now, you've probably heard the claim that the average age of the American combat soldier in Vietnam was 19. That is one of the most quoted statistics about the war, popularized by Paul Hardcastle's 1985 song 19. It's also wrong. The actual average age of U.S. servicemen killed in Vietnam was 23.11, according to the Defense Department's Combat Area Casualty File. But that number hides something important. 61% of those killed were younger than 21. In the Marine Corps specifically, 40% of enlisted combat deaths were teenagers. 83% were between 17 and 21. And those young Marines saw far more combat than their World War II counterparts. The average infantryman in Vietnam experienced roughly 240 days of combat in a single year. In World War II, that number was 40 days spread across 4 years. Helicopter mobility meant constant deployments. For teenagers carrying rifles in places like An Hoa, the war never stopped. But the use of children in this war wasn't limited to the American side. Across the lines, the situation was even more widespread. Child and adolescents participation on the Vietnamese side was far more widespread than on the American side, though it took very different forms. On the Viet Cong side, a 2022 academic study by Mai An Nguyen, published in the journal Critical Studies on Security, documented children as young as 9 and 10 carrying out intelligence gathering, sneaking into American bases, and running errands for guerrilla units. By 13 and 14, many were actively fighting as sappers, couriers, lookouts, and booby trap builders. The Viet Cong celebrated youth participation with honorific titles. Kids were called Iron Fort Children, or Valiant Destroyer of the Yanks. Propaganda icons like Kim Dong, a boy killed at 14 serving as a courier during the earlier war against France, were held up as national heroes. Now, what makes the Vietnamese case complicated is that according to Nguyen's research, most of these child combatants were volunteers. They were driven by patriotic indoctrination, family tradition, peer networks, and first-hand experience of French and then American violence against their communities. In North Vietnam, the formal draft age for the People's Army was 18, but the 1968 to 1972 manpower crisis pulled in 17-year-olds and accepted 16-year-old volunteers. The larger youth mobilization came through the Youth Shock Brigades, established in 1950. Vietnamese sources cite over 350,000 members between 1950 and 1975, predominantly young women aged 16 to 20, with some as young as 13. They repaired roads under B-52 carpet bombing. They defused unexploded ordnance. They manned anti-aircraft posts and evacuated wounded soldiers. Casualty estimates range from 20,000 to 40,000 dead. At the Dong Loc Junction alone, 10 young female volunteers aged 17 to 24 were killed together by a single bomb on July 24, 1968, while repairing the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Their memorial remains one of the most visited sites in Vietnam today. Over on the South Vietnamese side, the June 1968 General Mobilization Law lowered the draft age to 18 and required all males aged 16 to 50 to serve in some capacity. The People's Self-Defense Force, created after the Tet Offensive, enrolled males as young as 16 and reached a paper strength of 2 to 3 million. Contemporary reports described urban members as street corner kids from 12 to 16 who'd been given automatic weapons. Kids fought on every side of this war, and on every side the damage followed them home. The psychological toll of Vietnam was devastating. 58,169 Americans killed, over 304,000 wounded, 75,000 severely disabled. Amputations and crippling injuries ran 300% higher than in World War II. But the invisible wounds, those ran far deeper. And for the youngest veterans, they ran the longest. The term post-traumatic stress disorder didn't even exist when those soldiers returned. PTSD was only added to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in 1980, largely because Vietnam veterans and the psychiatrists who treated them fought for its recognition. Before that, the previous category, gross stress reaction, had actually been removed from the DSM in 1968, the same year the war was at its most intense. The landmark National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study, published in 1990, found that 30.9% of male Vietnam theater veterans developed PTSD at some point after the war. An additional 22.5% experienced partial PTSD symptoms. Now that means over half of all combat veterans were significantly affected. And age mattered here. Researchers found that entering Vietnam under the age of 25, serving in enlisted ranks below sergeant, and having lower education attainment were all independently associated with higher PTSD rates. The younger you were when you arrived, the more likely the damage would be permanent. The 2012-2013 National Vietnam Veterans Longitudinal Study follow-up found that approximately 271,000 Vietnam theater veterans still had full or sub-threshold PTSD 40 years after the war had ended. Veterans who had PTSD in 1987 were nearly twice as likely to have died by 2013. Think about that. 40 years later, and hundreds of thousands of men were still carrying the war inside of them daily. For the ones who went in as teenagers, those scars were the only adult life that they ever knew. So, what did the government actually do about the children who slipped through the cracks in the system? To be clear, there was no major investigation into Vietnam-era underage enlistment. No congressional hearing specifically targeting the recruiters who looked the other way. No systematic count of how many minors even served. The military handled individual cases quietly, usually with honorable discharges. The November 1965 McNamara Directive banning combat deployment of 17-year-olds was the most significant wartime reform. Real verification, things like certified birth certificates, social security cross-checks, and notarized parental consent, only came with computerization through the 1980s and 1990s. In fact, it wasn't until January 1st, 2019, that the Uniform Code of Military Justice was updated with Article 93A, which criminalized recruiter misconduct, including the concealment of applicant information, more than 50 years after Dan Bullock died. And speaking of Dan, his grave sat unmarked for 31 years. It took a television host, Sally Jesse Raphael, to purchase his headstone in the year 2000. NYPD officers, state troopers from 4 states, and 2 veteran motorcycle groups escorted a 600-mile caravan from Brooklyn to Goldsboro for the ceremony. In 2003, New York City renamed a section of Lee Avenue PFC Dan Bullock Way. North Carolina installed a highway historical marker near his childhood home in 2017. He was only 15. His boot camp buddy, Franklin MacArthur, spent years trying to raise funds for a 7-foot memorial statue. He's the youngest kid killed, MacArthur said, and hardly anybody knows his name. Everybody should know who he was. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial draws more visitors than any other memorial at the National Mall. One veteran called it the parade we never got. Among those 58,220 names are teenagers who should have been in high school. Boys who lied about their age because they believed in something, or because they had nowhere else to go. And a system that was supposed to protect them simply didn't. Dan's name sits on panel 23W, line 96. He was 15, and every failure that killed him, the unverified documents, the quota-driven recruiters, the pipeline that absorbed bodies faster than it questioned them, produced many more who survived and carried their silence home for decades. If this story matters to you, share it. If you want to learn more about the Vietnam War, we have more videos on this channel that go deep into the history that nobody else wants to talk about. Subscribe so you don't miss out.